When it comes to making videos, auto exposure and auto shutter speed often get a bad rep. But let's be realistic. For things like talkie sections or vlogging, they can really be a lifesaver. If you're obsessing over the 180-degree shutter rule or the 24 frames per second cinematic look, then you're sometimes sacrificing usability. Why risk bad exposure just for that film look? Focus on your story and never the endless settings of the camera. And remember, perfection is the enemy of great. I'm aiming to keep this video fairly short, but please don't underestimate the importance of this. It's very easy to get caught up in what you see on YouTube about how you have to have that 180-degree shutter rule, get the motion blur that the human eye sees, and that's absolutely true when it comes to doing cinematic pieces. But if you're walking along the street and you're just holding your Osmo Pocket 3, is a cinematic look that important? Or is it being properly exposed and making sure that the footage is usable? That's the aim of this video. So before we get into that, I've got a few caveats that I want to talk about. Caveat number one is to make sure that you have fairly steady light. If the sun is coming in and out of the clouds every couple of seconds, then this won't work. But a way to deal with this is to make sure that your clips are nice and short. That way, if there's a huge transition in light throughout your shot, you can cut it and minimise the impact on the overall footage. And the final caveat is get creative. You can hide significant light changes just by using some fades, some transitions, or just being a little bit more creative with your cuts. Last thing before we get started is, I also use the auto colour mode, because again, when I'm doing vloggy and talky bits, I don't think the colour or the cinematic quality of the footage is quite as important as the drone shots or the reveals and the photography, and it really helps me just focus on delivering the story. That said, the DJI Osmo Pocket's auto colour mode is absolutely fantastic. You can also boost it in your post-processing software. You might not have as much scope to do that if you'd shot it in D-Log, but it's still entirely usable, and it makes the whole process of editing much more efficient and takes much less time. So let's stop fumbling about with those tiny ND filters and let's look at what's possible. So a real proper tip here is to make sure that when you set your automatic settings that you choose to put a range for your ISO settings. The Osmo Pocket 3 allows you to set a range between say 50 ISO to 200 or 400 or 600, and I tend to have mine set between 50 and 200. That way I control how much change there is going to be in the light and the footage. As you can see from the footage here, this for me is where the Osmo Pocket 3 really shines. It's the same settings, I'm facing into the sun and away from the sun, but the automatic exposure takes care of that. When faced with really challenging light conditions, what I like to do is I set my Osmo Pocket 3 to choose an automatic exposure, and once it's done that, I then switch it to manual mode, which then saves those settings and I now don't need to worry about them. Again, it doesn't think about things like shutter speed or exposure, but what it does do is ensure that you get a great exposure throughout your entire clip. Here is an example of when I used an ND filter, thought I had the thing set up correctly, but as you can see, the footage is just terrible. Viewers of the channel will know that I'm not a huge fan of the DJI conversion LUT because I sometimes think it's heavy-handed, but as you've just seen, sometimes it does just a fantastic job. Whilst automatic exposure is a phenomenal tool to get used to, there are times when you shouldn't use it, and that's mainly when you're using time-lapse modes, or if there's rapidly changing light, or if you yourself choose that you want to have a moody artistic choice in your footage. But here's a good example. This is a time-lapse, and there is a constant exposure because I have not set it to an automatic mode. The darker the sky gets, the darker the footage gets, and that is exactly what I was going for. Now, in the fairness of balance, there are times where it makes sense to slap on an ND filter, get your exposure exactly how you like it, and set it in manual mode. What you can see here from this footage is that the sun is dipping out from behind the hills, and it's also getting obstructed by the trees as I walk through it. But because I've chosen a good exposure, I've got the correct ND filter on here, this footage is entirely usable and it actually looks absolutely fantastic. My last use case scenario for this is when you're driving in a car. All too often I'm driving along, it's nice and sunny, and then I go around a corner and before you know it, it's dark. Having the automatic mode set here would have adjusted for this and given me a constant exposure while I tried to do this talkie bit. So I hope you found that useful, but more than that, I hope it's given you a bit more belief in your camera and to trust the auto modes. I've given you advice on when and how to use them and when you shouldn't use them. But don't be scared of them. You might think you're cheating, but it's not. It's about making things easier for yourself and making sure that you go out and make more videos and take more photographs. And that ultimately is why we are all here. Before I go, I just wanted to say thank you for watching the video. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now's a good time to do that. We're closing in on 900 subscribers and we've only got 100 to go until we hit that magical figure of 1,000. So if you've got any comments, any opinions, please leave them in the comments below, and if you can leave a like for the video, it helps me more than you could know. I'll see you in the next one.